Some mornings in this courtroom stay with you longer than others. The morning Alexandra Whitmore walked through those doors was one I will not forget. The dress she wore that day probably cost more than most working families see in half a year. Arrogance has a particular look, and she wore it better than she wore that silk. Before a single word had left her mouth, my jaw was already tight. And when she did finally speak, every syllable landed with the kind of contempt that told me immediately this was not going to be an ordinary morning. Before those 40 minutes were over, the life she had always taken for granted would be unrecognizable to her. My courtroom has a way of doing that to people who believe their wealth makes them untouchable. 3 charges were printed on the file that sat open in front of me: reckless driving, leaving the scene of an accident, obstruction of justice. The story behind those charges was not complicated. A red light, a rear-end collision, significant damage done to a minivan, and a driver who stepped out of that minivan hoping to exchange information with the person who had just hit her. What she got instead was laughter, a comment about her car being a piece of junk, and a view of taillights as Alexandra Whitmore drove away. Traffic cameras caught the entire sequence without missing a frame. The evidence was airtight. What gave this case its unusual weight was not the footage, but the last name on the file. Richard Whitmore, Alexandra's father, had built Whitmore Technologies into a company worth an estimated $2.3 billion. Charitable foundations across the city carried the Whitmore name. Hospital wings had been funded by Whitmore money. Civic boards counted Whitmore family members among their seats. Downtown buildings displayed that name on their facades. Alexandra had grown up inside all of that, and it showed in every step she took as she entered my courtroom. The clock had already moved 20 minutes past her scheduled time when she finally appeared. This was not the kind of late that happens to people caught in unexpected circumstances. This was the kind of late that sends a message. Her attorney arrived first, moving quickly, words of apology already forming before he had fully cleared the doorway. Alexandra followed at her own pace, unhurried, unbothered. The click of designer heels on tile announced her the way an entrance at a social event might. Sunglasses remained on her face. A designer bag hung from her arm. The silk dress was the color of cream and probably made to order, the kind of garment that shows every mark, chosen by someone who never expects to get dirty. Nothing she wore that morning belonged in a courtroom. Every piece of it had been selected to make a statement about who she believed herself to be. She had made it to her table before I spoke. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate you making the time to join us. I would be curious to hear what kept you." With no particular urgency, she removed the sunglasses, taking her time folding them. "Traffic," she said. "You know how these things are. No acknowledgement of the delay. No, Your Honor. No trace of an apology." The response had the casual energy of someone discussing an inconvenience with a friend. Her attorney moved quickly to fill the silence. "Your Honor, please accept our sincere apologies. This will not happen again." I acknowledged him with a nod and then directed my full attention back to Alexandra. "Miss Whitmore, courtrooms operate on schedules. 9 in the morning is not a suggestion. When I am expecting you, I expect you here. Do we have an understanding?" She looked at me and shrugged. "Sure." An actual shrug. In my courtroom. The seats behind her were filled. The people who follow proceedings in this building regularly had found their places, and beside them sat journalists who had recognized the Whitmore name in the case listings. 3rd row, directly behind the defense table, sat Maria Chen. Her minivan had been the one Alexandra destroyed at that red light. By profession, Maria was a hospice nurse, the kind of person who shows up every shift ready to give everything she has to people living through the hardest chapter of their lives. 12-hour shifts were her normal. On the morning of the accident, she had been on the way to drop her 2 children off at school. She was in the gallery now wearing scrubs, still in the clothes she had worked through the night in, watching Alexandra Whitmore treat this entire process as though it were an interruption in her social calendar. Taking my time with the file again served a purpose. People who are accustomed to controlling every room they walk into tend to unravel when the room stops responding to them. The silence stretched. When I looked up, a phone had found its way into Alexandra's hand beneath the table. "Miss Whitmore, the phone needs to go away." Her head came up. Caught. "Just finishing something," she said. "Something important. Nothing happening beneath that table qualifies as more important than what is happening in this room. Put it away." The sound she made before dropping the phone into her bag was the sound of someone who has never genuinely been told no. "Counselor," her attorney said, clearing his throat with purpose. "Your Honor, if we could move things along. My client has obligations she needs to get to later today." Later today. The morning was already being mentally filed away as an inconvenience to be cleared so she could return to her actual life. I straightened and looked at him directly. "The charges your client is here to answer for include reckless driving, hit and run, and obstruction of justice. These are not administrative violations. Unless whatever she has scheduled this afternoon is a genuine medical emergency, this courtroom takes priority over all of it. We will finish when we are finished." Something passed between Alexandra and her attorney in a whisper. His response was a firm, urgent shake of his head. She said it anyway. "Your Honor, honestly, the whole thing has been exaggerated beyond recognition. One car bumped another. That is what insurance companies were created to handle. One car bumped another. The minivan Maria Chen drove that day was a total loss. Her children had been frightened badly enough that the fear followed them home. 3 days of her life had been swallowed whole by the fallout. And the person responsible for all of it was standing before me, describing it as one car bumping another. "Miss Whitmore," I said, using the tone that tends to produce immediate stillness in experienced attorneys, "walk me through what you believe happened that day. You struck a vehicle at a red light. The damage to that vehicle was significant. The law is clear on what is required of you after an accident. You are required to stop. You are required to provide your information. You did neither of those things. And you are describing this as exaggerated." "It was an accident," she said. "Accidents are not crimes. Everybody knows that." The attorney beside her had adopted the posture of a man who desperately wished he were somewhere else. Everything he had prepared her for, every instruction he had given her about conduct, about tone, about showing basic remorse in front of a judge, had apparently not made the journey with her into this room. The footage from the traffic camera was ready on the monitor. "Let us look at what the cameras recorded," I said. The image was clear enough to leave nothing to interpretation. Alexandra's BMW at the red light. The collision. Maria's minivan absorbing the impact. Maria stepping out, visibly shaken, making her way first to the back seat to check on her children before turning toward the other vehicle. Then Alexandra getting out, assessing the scene, and speaking words the audio picked up with reasonable clarity. "Whatever. It is a piece of junk anyway." The BMW then maneuvered around the damaged minivan and ran the red light. When the footage ended, the courtroom held its quiet. Alexandra's expression had not shifted. There was no discomfort there, no recognition, nothing. "Miss Whitmore, do you recall the words you directed at Miss Chen while standing at the scene?" "Not particularly. I was in a stressful moment. The recording captured you describing her vehicle as a piece of junk." The corner of her mouth moved in a way that belonged somewhere between amusement and disdain. Honestly, it was not far off. The gallery responded. Her attorney covered his face with both hands. That reaction told me everything I needed to know about where the next few minutes were headed. Standing up from this bench is not something I do casually. Enough years in this room have given certain gestures a weight that people feel before they can name it. Miss Whitmore, what you just said deserves your full attention. Video evidence of you leaving an accident scene played in front of this entire courtroom. Your response to that evidence was to ridicule the person you left behind. Is that a fair description of what just happened? Something moved across her face. Not remorse, but the first suggestion that the ground beneath her might not be as solid as she had assumed. That came out differently than I intended it. Then tell me what you intended. My vehicle is considerably more valuable than hers was. Damage to a less valuable car is simply going to cost less to repair. The logic she presented was so far removed from any reasonable framework that I needed a moment to sit with it. This was not simply a person raised with too much money. Something more essential was absent. Your vehicle being more valuable, I said, means that the harm you caused matters less. That is the conclusion you are drawing. More or less, she said. Yes. Her attorney rose. Your Honor, I would like a moment with my client. Sit down, counselor. Your client is communicating clearly, and I prefer to hear it directly. Turning back to Alexandra, I asked her to take me through her thinking from the moment of impact. She drew a slow breath, the kind reserved for explaining simple things to people struggling to follow. She had been running behind for a meeting. The light shifted and her foot missed the brake. These things happen. They happen to everyone. And after your vehicle made contact with a car that had children sitting in the back seat, what did you observe when you stepped out? She said she looked. Everyone appeared to be fine. Children are dramatic by nature. Across the room, Maria Chen pressed a tissue to her face. The expression she carried held grief and fury in equal measure. Miss Whitmore, fine is not a word that describes what those children experienced. Weeks of nightmares followed that morning. The younger child refused to get into a car. Her immediate reply carried no pause at all. The mother created that. Children read their parents. If she had stayed composed, none of that would have happened. I did not cause that. What followed was not silence. Voices rose from the gallery. The bailiff restored order. Alexandra's own attorney sat back in his chair, wearing an expression I rarely see on seasoned legal professionals: genuine shock. I let the room settle and then spoke at a volume and pace that cut through everything remaining in the air. You are assigning blame for two children's trauma to their mother, the woman you struck, the woman you drove away from. Children mirror the people raising them. A calm mother produces calm children. That is not something I'm responsible for. 40 years on this bench have brought me face to face with a wide range of defendants. People consumed by guilt who could barely lift their eyes from the floor. People who had caused serious harm but who grasped the reality of what they had done. People who arrived broken and left with something closer to understanding. Alexandra Whitmore fit none of those descriptions. She represented a pattern I have watched grow more common over the years. Wealth and insulation so complete and so long-standing that the idea of consequence had simply never been allowed to take root. Let us turn to the hours that followed, I said. Your actions after leaving the scene are documented in the police report. From the accident, you went directly to your country club. Lunch was had. 9 holes of golf were played. Your insurance provider received no contact from you for 3 full days, and that contact only happened because Miss Chen had tracked your license plate and the investigation had already begun. Is that account accurate? She said she had needed time to process things. Time to process. Maria Chen used those same 3 days trying to work out how to get herself to a job she could not afford to miss without the car that had just been destroyed. She spent those days arranging her children's lives around a transportation problem she had not created. She spent those days calculating costs she had not planned for. Alexandra's response arrived without any visible discomfort. Insurance handles these situations. That is the entire purpose of it. Insurance you waited 3 days to contact. She said she had been occupied. Life had continued. One incident does not halt everything else. The driving record in front of me added its own dimension to the picture. 3 speeding violations across 2 years. A red light citation. A reckless driving charge that had been quietly reduced through legal maneuvering. Each entry on its own might be explained away. Together they described someone for whom the rules of the road had long been treated as optional. Miss Whitmore, this is not the first time your conduct behind the wheel has required legal attention. Everyone exceeds the speed limit from time to time, she said. Leaving an accident scene is a different category entirely from speeding. What I did was leave. The distinction she was drawing told me more than any piece of evidence in the file. You departed an accident scene without providing your information. The law has a name for that. It is called a hit and run. It is a criminal offense. Her expression closed off. Her father's attorney had told her this case was going away, and that was the real foundation everything else had been built on. Someone had looked her in the eye and told her that people with her name and her family's history do not face consequences for things like this. Your father's attorney is not seated in this courtroom. I am. Decisions in this room belong to me. But she pressed on. With a record like mine and a family presence like ours in this community. My hand went up. Stop. I have no interest in your family's community presence. Your father's name carries no authority in here. The club memberships, the charity donations, the buildings with the family name on them, none of it enters into what happens in this room. You are a defendant who broke the law. That is the only relevant fact. For the first time, the certainty behind her eyes began to show its edges. What do you mean none of it matters? It means your last name is not a shield. Not here. She turned to her attorney with something approaching desperation. He had nothing to offer her. He had seen enough courtrooms to know exactly where this was going. I reached for the sentencing documents. Miss Whitmore, a hit and run resulting in property damage carries meaningful penalties under the law. When the incident involves children, when the defendant presents a documented history of reckless behavior behind the wheel, and when the courtroom has witnessed an utter absence of remorse from start to finish, those penalties move in one direction. You cannot be serious about this, she said. I am entirely serious. And the sentence I'm about to hand down is going to introduce you to something that your upbringing clearly did not. The color left her face. Since walking into this room, she had carried herself as though the outcome had already been settled in her favor. That certainty was gone now. Before the sentence is announced, there is something I want you to hear, I said, lifting a folder prepared by my clerk. Miss Chen submitted a victim impact statement to this court. Every word of it is going to be read aloud in this room. Alexandra sat up slightly. Her attorney moved his hand toward her arm. She pulled away from him. I opened the folder. My name is Maria Chen. Raising 2 children on my own has been the defining work of my life. My son is 9 years old. My daughter, Emma, is 7. On the morning of March 15th, a single decision made by another person rewrote the terms of our daily existence. The room had gone completely quiet. Stopped at a red light on the way to school, I felt the impact before I understood what had happened. My body lurched forward. My head met the steering wheel. From the back seat, Emma began screaming. Michael was asking whether we were going to die. I glanced up. Alexandra had gone still, her eyes fixed somewhere on the table in front of her. After checking on my children, I got out of the car. There was blood on my forehead from the steering wheel. I walked toward the other vehicle. The driver looked directly at me. She saw my face. She saw my children through the rear window, and then she drove away. I let those words settle before continuing. 3 days passed before I knew who had hit us. The investigation was moving, but identifying the vehicle took time. My car was beyond repair. A rental was not something I could afford. 2 days of work were lost because I had no way to get there. Those were wages I did not have the margin to lose. My children missed school. I continued without pausing. The financial damage was real and it was serious, but the damage I could not calculate in dollars was worse. Getting into a car has become a source of fear for both of my children. Emma wakes up from nightmares about the crash. Every morning, Michael asks me whether something like that is going to happen again. The sense of safety that children are supposed to carry through their days was taken from them. It was taken by someone who could not give 5 minutes to face what she had done. By this point, Alexandra's hands were no longer steady. I am a nurse. I work at County General Hospital. Every shift I spend caring for people who are frightened, who are in pain, who need someone to stay present with them rather than walk away. The person who drove away from my children that morning showed none of what I try to give my patients every day. She saw 2 scared kids and she chose to leave. I closed the folder and looked at Alexandra directly. That is the person you chose to be on that morning, Miss Whitmore. Someone who looked at children who were frightened and injured and decided that her schedule mattered more than their safety. I did not realize how scared they were, Alexandra said, her voice quieter than it had been at any point in the morning. You made a choice that prevented you from ever knowing. Her attorney opened his mouth. I stopped him before anything came out. This court has listened to excuses and deflection since this proceeding began. What comes next is accountability. I straightened everything in front of me and looked at Alexandra Whitmore. Guilt on the charge of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in property damage and personal injury has been established. The sentence is as follows: 60 days in county jail, standard custody, not home confinement, not work release, jail. She exhaled sharply. That is not something you can do. It is done. Your driving privileges are suspended for 1 year beginning immediately. At the conclusion of that year, reinstatement will require you to pass both the written examination and the road test again from the beginning. 200 hours of community service are to be completed at County General Hospital, the same facility where Miss Chen works. You will be present in a place that exists to help people. Perhaps being surrounded by that purpose will teach you something. Her protests about prior commitments and scheduled events dissolved in the air before they fully formed. Those schedules have been reorganized. Full financial restitution to Miss Chen is ordered, covering the total loss of her vehicle, her medical treatment, her lost wages, and all costs associated with the therapy her children require. I was not at the end. Attendance at a victim impact panel is also required. You will sit and listen to people whose lives were permanently altered by drivers who left the scene. Their stories will be your education. The tears that came were not the kind that carry remorse inside them. They were the tears of someone who had just discovered that the walls she had always relied on were not there. Your Honor, this is disproportionate, her attorney said, pushing back. His client had no prior criminal record, he argued. Her age deserved consideration. The history of reckless behavior in this file and the complete absence of anything resembling accountability in this room are the relevant factors, I told him. This sentence exists to interrupt a pattern before it causes irreparable harm to someone else. One final time I looked at Alexandra. You told me this morning that you are busy, that you have places to be, that your time is valuable. Let me tell you where the value actually lives. It lives in a 7-year-old girl who cannot make it through a night without waking up afraid. It lives in a 9-year-old boy who begins every morning by asking his mother if today is going to be safe. It lives in a woman who gives everything she has to help strangers heal, and who was left bleeding at a red light by someone who could not be bothered to stop. The tears were coming freely now, but I had not finished. Every door that opened for you in your life opened because of money that was never yours to begin with. Every consequence that should have found you was turned away at the gate. Nobody ever looked you in the eye and told you that there are limits. Today that changes. The gavel was in my hand. When you are lying in that bunk at night, I want your mind to go to Emma and Michael, to the nightmares, to the fear, to every morning that starts with a child asking whether the world is safe. Think about what a single decision to stay and face what you did would have changed for all of them. Alexandra had both hands over her face. Perhaps when you walk out of that facility, the person leaving will be someone who understands that other lives carry as much weight as her own, that having money is not an identity, that what a person is made of only becomes visible when things go wrong and they have to decide who they are going to be. The gavel came down. Bailiffs, take her into custody. The composure she had carried through the entire morning came apart completely. She turned toward the gallery, reaching out toward her father. Daddy, please, do something. Richard Whitmore rose from his seat slowly. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then he spoke. Alexandra, he said. His voice carried disappointment the way stone carries weight. You brought this on yourself. He sat back down. The bailiffs moved to her. The designer heels struck the courthouse floor in a different rhythm now, each step leading her further from the version of life she had always assumed was permanent. Her mother watched her go, but did not move. Maria Chen had remained in her seat through all of it, hands folded, waiting. Miss Chen, I said, this courtroom belongs to you for a moment if you would like it. She stood. Quiet strength is the only way I know how to describe how she carried herself in that moment. Your Honor, I am not someone who finds satisfaction in watching another person suffer. But my children needed to see this. They needed to see that the rules apply to everyone. That doing harm to someone and driving away does not simply get forgiven because your family has money. Her voice gathered itself as she continued. Last week, Emma asked me something that I did not know how to answer. She asked whether being rich means you do not have to follow the same rules as everyone else. She is 7 years old, and she was already learning that some people are treated as though they matter more. I could not tell her she was wrong because I was not sure. She turned her eyes toward the door through which Alexandra had been taken. Today I can go home and tell her that she was wrong, that everyone is held to the same standard in the right courtroom, that justice is still real. Thank you, Your Honor. The applause that rose from the gallery was not something I moved to stop. People need to see this. They need to be in the room when accountability actually happens.